Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this very special teleclass tonight, or teleservice, whatever form you use. We have a very, very, very special guest tonight with us, Reverend Nettie Spiwack. I'm so happy to have her. She's a longtime member of Celebrating Life, a Reverend, but she wears many, 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 many hats. And I'm so happy that our CLM group gets to host this teleclass to really get to know who we have within our community, because there's a rich tradition of many different traditions, and Nettie is a classic when it comes to multiple, going deeper into the divine. So would you give a Celebrating Life welcome to Nettie Spiwack?
Yay. Oh, thank you, Paul. Thanks. So I'm going to assume that you and I are unmuted. You can hear me, right?
Very clearly,
Checking.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And Paul had asked me to start with a song, and typically I don't like singing on the telephone, not even the happy birthday.
Oh, there you go.
Right. But I said I will start with a chant as an invocation. And just to give people a little background, I'm sure some people know these and some people don't. I'm going to do 3 Sanskrit chants. And the first one is the Gayatri Mantra. And we're starting with that because it's an appeal to the light, to illuminate our intellect, and to dispel our ignorance so we can merge with the divine. And the second one is what's called, it's the Guru Dhyan. So it is the meditation on the Guru. Now the Guru is not the person who you might pray to in a picture. It's really God, the presence of God or the divine. So we ask that that presence be invoked. And lastly, I'm going to do the Maha Mrityunjaya mantra. So that's a mouthful, also known as the Triambakam. But believe me, after my whole life, I can still barely say the name of it. But no, that's the truth. It's the first mantra I ever learned.
Wow.
But it is one of the oldest, and it is the invocation of immortality, the death-defying mantra. So here we go. Okay, so take a deep breath.
Perfect.
And I'm just going to start with 3 Oms, and I will be doing Om Shanti in between the 3 prayers.
Okay.
Om. 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 Bhuvaswaha Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodayat. Om Bhuvaswaha Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodayat. Om Bhuvaswaha Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandim Pushtivardhanam Urvakamiva Bandhanam Mrityor Mukshiyam Amritat Swaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. We ask the Holy Spirit in all His and her divine forms to enter into each one of our hearts, homes, and intellect now, and bless Paul and myself tonight to speak through us, heal through us, love through us, and feel through us, and be our voice and our mind and our hearts as we offer all that we are and all that we have and do at the divine feet. And so it is.
And so it is.
So it is.
That was such a rich chanting. Really, I call it Still My Heart. I love to hear chanting. I'm not always really good at leading it, but following it is just magnificent. So I just want to say thank you for that invocation. And it really covered a lot of I call it the spiritual traditions in that. So thank you, Nettie. And I think it might be a good idea to let people know your background because it's so full and rich. So would you do that for us?
Sure. So for those who don't know me personally, I was born into a very rich and wonderful Jewish culture. And I often define it as a post-Holocaust community, meaning I grew up around many survivors. And Judaism was I was not in a religious paradigm at all, but it was intensely Jewish, and other Jewish people understand that because there was a desire to hold on to the Jewish identity, but not necessarily to go to temple. So there was a lot of mixed, different kinds of backgrounds in that regard. And when I was about 17 years old, I was on a trip to Israel. My sister lived in Israel, and my mother and my brother were there. And in short, I had a revelation about Jesus when I was standing in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Wow.
And when you're a nice Jewish girl from the Bronx, that's not good news to your parents.
That's for sure. Yes, I get the picture.
So I definitely kept that to myself for a while until it came spilling out. And my folks yanked me out of school, where I had been in school in Kansas City and in art school. And that began a long journey I was very fortunate to have some great exposure to a lot of both psychological and transformational work until eventually, and I kind of put my spiritual life underground until somewhere in the 90s. So to put it very, very simply, I went to India for the first time on a conference. It was not a spiritual pilgrimage, but when I came back, I had what is classically known as a Kundalini awakening. And that experience brought me to many things eventually because it was a very painful experience, physically, emotionally, in many ways. But I did recognize what was happening at some level. And eventually that landed me at the feet of Satya Sai Baba, who became my Sadguru. I have had many teachers, and Ron Roth was one of them. Sai Baba basically sent me to Ron Roth. Wow. And then I became part of Celebrating Life 18 years ago, and I'm still here.
That's amazing. I know because...
Go ahead.
I laugh at that because I'm pretty much very traditional, almost exact opposite as you, but yet our hearts sing when it comes for devotional. So that really is the link that really is soul to soul there. And Nettie, I want to highlight something you just said. When you had your Kundalini experience that you said, because when people think of that, they'll say, oh, it had to be beautiful, blissful. It was part of that. But then it also had the other side of it where it becomes transformational. Now, that hurts in a very painful way. But I appreciate you bringing that up because I really haven't heard someone say that before. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Well, I want to say, Paul, and thank you for bringing that up, that my Kundalini awakening was not the entire whole 9 yards where people go into the bliss experience. So, we could do a whole separate class on that, but I knew it definitely transformed my consciousness. There's no question. And it was a year long and had a lot of physical manifestations, and I saw a lot of doctors and had a lot of tests because it was all neurological. And it was really Norm Shealy, actually, who in the end...
Oh, really?
Yeah, when I was and I was out in his PhD program, which I didn't finish, but I did begin, and I was describing it to Norm. I mean, it was a few years after, and he said, Nettie, it sounds like a classic Kundalini experience to me. So when a neurosurgeon tells you that,
ta-da!
That was I was at. But what you want to come back to what you just said. By the way, for those of you who don't know this, I have 18 years of making Paul laugh. It's one of my favorite things to do. If I can get Paul to laugh, it's a good day. But on a slightly more serious note, I mean,
I know.
The topic tonight, and I think I surprised you a little bit, but it really grows right out of what you just said about transformations of consciousness. And even what people think of Kundalini, right? It's like, oh, and it'll rush up my spine and I'll go into bliss.
Yeah.
Yes, but it might burn you to a crisp along the way and make you toast.
I understand that. Yeah.
So I selected some stories about one of the things that has always drawn me is the world culture. I'm an interfaith minister through a different discipline. I went to seminary for that. And I love the different cultures of the world. And for the past 15, 20 years, I've been steeped in Indian culture. But prior to that, my aunt gave me a book on Greek mythology when I was 10 years old, and I ate that up.
Wow.
And Christianity and many of this. So I don't know every tradition, but I do appreciate, and some of you may be aware of Jung or archetypes or Joseph Campbell and all of those things. And I'd love to speak to that a little bit if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do that.
I just want to kind of say that to go into this, that the first point by a little background, I had a very, very life-transforming experience in India in 2005. It was between 2004 and 2005. And without going into all of the details, I will say that along the way, I was at Sai Baba's ashram, and I went across the street to a bookstore, and I prayed to be shown something. I wanted to read the great Indian epic, which is called the Mahabharata, or the Great Epic of India. And in those days, the name itself sounded to me like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Mahabharata.
Spell that one.
Say it. Right, couldn't even say it. So I did pray over a translation, like, okay, get this one, and I shipped it home in those days by ship, and took months to arrive, but it arrived at the right moment. And once I opened it, I could not put it down. This was an English translation. And I spoke to one of my Indian friends. I told her that I was reading the Mahabharata, and she said to me, Nettie, watch out. She said, when you take in certain things, she said, people who read the Mahabharata, sometimes it destroys their life at the end. And she meant it undoes your, whatever was your life.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I did was I didn't finish the last page.
You're always breaking the rules.
I am. But eventually I did, and it didn't help. So I'm not going to talk about Mahabharata tonight, but I am going to talk about 4.
Yeah, I'll leave that one out.
Right. But the reason I brought that up was because there are stories that, in fact, they're not stories. They are encoded instructions from the rishis, from the great ones. I started with the Gayatri Mantra, and I can tell you that in the beginning was the word, right? In the beginning was the Gayatri Mantra. The Gayatri Mantra, and I can't, again, I could do 5 classes on that. But let's just say those syllables were first heard. And to make it more available to people, as time went on, it became the Vedas. And the Vedas then came into the stories of the Purans, which are the stories that we know. I'll talk about a little bit. But one of the quotes from Sai Baba that I love is he says, listen, just because you didn't know that, like, for example, you didn't know that China existed doesn't mean the country didn't exist. And the fact that people found out about the Vedas doesn't mean that when they were written down, that's when they have always existed. So the stories, I thought about this and about spring, that the spring is a time for renewal, rebirth. And as I wrote to you, Paul, I said one of my favorite things that Ron Roth used to say was he said that, if you listen really closely in the spring outside, here's something you'll never hear. You'll never hear the flowers going, you won't hear that. Spring comes and these stores of energy, the bulbs in the ground, everything gets the signal to grow. And so I have 4 stories I want to talk about that they came to me, I'm assuming they were given to me to talk about, and 2 of them are male and 2 of them are female. They both have men and women in them, but 2 of them are male. And the first one, of course, is we've just finished Passover, right? We just finished Passover and Easter. And Passover has, for those people who I know, Virginia's on the phone, and I know that Virginia's probably been to at least one Seder and being married to Rick over these years.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
I'm sure. And Paul, maybe you've been at one. I don't know.
Yes,
have you?
I have. Yes, I have. Yeah.
Right. So the thing that you'll hear year in and year out when people recite the story is, once we were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with his outstretched arm, and that is said over and over and over again. So we can spend an infinite amount of time talking about the Exodus, and it's really not a spring story except for two big things. One is we do it in the spring. So for me, it's always about spring. I mean, making Passover, my mom would buy daffodils, stuff like that. It happens in the spring on our calendar. The second thing is lambing season was about the lamb that was sacrificed, and lambs are born in the spring.
Yes, they are.
So it is a spring story. But what it's really a story about is a moving from an older consciousness into the next stage of consciousness. And the Jews were slaves for 400 years, according to the biblical story.
Yeah.
So when you are enslaved, you develop a slave consciousness. And the truth is, we're always enslaved by something. For most of us, if you're in a body, you are enslaved in some way. You're enslaved to your wants and needs. You're enslaved to your physical desires, your attachments, whatever they are. So the story, of course, everybody knows. I mean, for me, it's still Charlton Heston I see as Moses. It's very hard to
good picture.
not see him anyway else. But, one of the things that got me in the Moses story was always that here God appears. What did they go through? There's 10 plagues in Egypt, right? They went through all of that. They get saved from the slaying of the firstborn. They get pursued by one of the greatest army on the planet. The water parts, and then they are led by a pillar of fire at night and a dust cloud by day, and then there was no food. So I'm going to pause here for talk about food, because that's part of what I want to talk about. So God sends manna, right? Manna from heaven. And Paul, do you remember anything about the instruction about manna? Here's a little Old Testament quiz. You may not know.
No, I don't. I'm going to say no.
Okay. All right. So the thing was, God provided the food, but only enough to be eaten for that day.
Yes, daily.
And if you tried to hoard it, it got full of manna.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the need was provided for that day. So here you had all of these amazing things. And wouldn't you think that by the time they reached Mount Sinai and Moses says, okay, I have to go talk to God for a while, wouldn't you think that at that point people would be patient? It's like, but no, it's like, well, what have you done for me? What have you done for me lately?
It's true.
He's
if
gone.
You really live that piece out, it's true. You have to ask that question.
You do. What have you done for me lately? And the thing is, this is in so many stories, not just this story, is that, then they go on, they build
our own story, too.
It's our own story.
Don't go there.
We have miracles and miracles and miracles, right? Do we not? Did you not see practically, almost like resurrections? You saw, and you see them all the time, right? And, all the time miracles, you have spent your life in the presence of these miracles. But tell the truth. Don't you have your moments where it's like, God, when are you going to take care of this?
True. We always slide that in under the cover, but there it is. I actually did that this week. I go, but God, like He don't know it. He knows our thoughts, so it's like, hello.
Right. Okay, well, you gave me manna. Okay, that's great. But what about tomorrow? What if you don't send it tomorrow?
Sounds like a little whiny.
Yeah. But in truth, that's what happened. And it's not just in that story. Now, the end of that, obviously I can't go into all the details. Most people know the details. Moses, out of an episode that happened, was not allowed to see the promised land. And the Jews had to wander for 40 years in the desert. Now, you got to get the picture that the geographic area they were wandering in 40 years, it was like chasing your tail in your backyard. Really. There was not enough territory to wander. But why did they wander was because the slave mentality had to die out.
Yes.
And a new consciousness had to be born, and in this case, in the younger people. And when I saw those kids from Parkland leading these rallies.
Wow.
That's what I thought. They're the Joshua.
Oh,
they're
perfect.
the Joshua.
Yes.
So
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Excuse me, I want to just insert this. Is like that concept of the old generation has died out. Now, if we take that personally, it's like old self, where I have the Kundalini experience, the born-again experience. We have to let go of the old of what we were conditioned with and now expand into the new. So this is perfect, and I call it this divine setup if you see it in the bigger picture. So thank you, Nettie, for one.
That it's perfect, and that's exactly about dying to. You have to literally, and Moses went through, if you look at it, there were a million mini trials, and each one, in a sense, they got bigger and bigger. Now, one of the greatest things that I learned from Ron Roth was the 5 stages of prayer and healing, because that is a template. They had these amazing experiences. And then even Moses had powers, right? He had powers to bring water from the rock or from stretch his staff out. But then there were great times of despair and like, go find yourself another leader. Who needs this? Who needs to feed 600,000 people in the desert and deal with that? I mean, it was tough. Right? But it's really, I want to move on to the next story because there's a couple. So the next one, of course, spring and tied in with Passover is the next extension is, of course, Jesus. Yeah. And Jesus is a story of a growth of consciousness as a pattern for growing yourself, as well as all the other symbolisms that we celebrate traditionally or in traditional Christianity. But he was, I'll just zero in on 2 elements. So the first one is that when he was baptized and God comes, the holy dove comes and he hears the voice, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Yeah. The very next thing that happens, I mean, that's like, in a sense, Paul, what you just said, like the Kundalini experience. And what's the next thing that happens? Do you remember? He has to withdraw, and he goes to the desert.
To the desert for 40 days.
He goes to the desert for 40 days, in partly after an enlightenment experience, as people like Carrie have taught from our own community or anyone I've ever studied with, there's always a period of integration.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
And you went through that.
I know. I didn't believe it until I went through it, and now I'm a believer. Absolutely.
That's right.
It's a spiritual law. Yes.
Yeah, you have to integrate. So you don't just get a download and then it's like, oh, okay, I'll meet you for coffee. It's, maybe some people do, but
maybe correct.
Maybe at some point, but the truth is there's usually an integration. And so Jesus goes and he has to be, there's a purification process that he goes through. And that's the temptation, right? The 40 days of getting tempted. And again, like Moses, what do you need all this for? I can make you the king. And we call that the satanic voice. But it was the test. It was really, am I going to live this life that I'm being called to? Am I going to do it? I could do something else. And I'm sure that voice was as much inside him as some guy with black wings standing outside. Right. So that was the first having to go through this delving into one's deeper consciousness and seeing what's there. And then the next one, so you don't get to do it just once, but the next big one, of course, is in the Garden of Gethsemane and the crucifixion. Yeah. Now, in 1999, I went to Egypt with Carolyn Mace, as a matter of fact. And perfect. I got to be in the pyramid. I remember something that I began to do a lot of studies about the pyramid and so on. And the Egyptians the pyramid was used, I believe, as an initiation chamber. And being in there and feeling energies. So it's an initiation into a higher consciousness. And those people who were on the mystery school path there eventually would be given a particular drink that put them in a state of, let's say, suspended animation in a sense, that took them into the deep world. And as one teacher said to me, and after 3 days in the period, you were left there. And either you died or you came out enlightened. And that person was called a Ptah, P-T-A-H. So again, 3 days in the tomb, 3 days in the pyramid. Oh, wow. 3 days in the tomb for a total transformation into a higher life. And we know all about the suffering. I don't have to go through all of that beforehand, and we've just come through Easter. But the point is everybody wants higher consciousness. Nobody wants to pay the tax.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yes. Like Ron Roth always says, for Pentecost, it's not penny free, it's penny cost. There's a cost to that higher consciousness.
Yeah. And so what happens, I want to switch gears and talk about the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone and Hades. So Demeter was the goddess of the earth, and she was responsible for all of our food and for all the beautiful things of the earth. And she had a daughter, Persephone. And Persephone was, of course, the embodiment of innocence and beauty. And one day, Demeter's brother, also, they were all related in Greek mythology, Hades, he's the god of the underworld. He sees the beautiful Persephone, and he comes and he abducts her down to the underworld. And Demeter has a fit and goes, basically, she demands that her daughter be released. So there's many versions of these stories, all of them, but here's the essential. Yeah. The essential is that Zeus says that she can be released as long as she has not consumed any food from the underworld. So she has, in fact, consumed 6 pomegranate seeds. Even though she knew she probably shouldn't, she did. And because of those 6 pomegranate seeds, she was allowed to come back onto the earth for 6 months a year, but every 6 months she had to go back to the underworld. So what is really the meaning of that story? First of all, innocence has to give way to a more mature consciousness. We have to. And there's part of it is we get taken away into this underworld. And in the underworld is your own worst fears, your own worst, you have to face your unconscious, let's put it that way. And Hades, there's many meanings of Hades, but one thing you could call it hell, not in the Christian sense of hell, but it's the land of the shades.
Yeah.
It means facing the things that one is most afraid of. And she had to go down there, but and I'm going to bring you back to the food thing. So there's 2 themes in these. One is that you're going to have to go through these uncomfortable transformations. The second is the symbolism of food. So in Moses, God provided, but for that day. With Jesus, the food symbolism, of course, is communion the night before, where he says, and Ron used to talk about taking the divine vibration in from the food. But in the next 2 stories, which is this story and the one that follows, a point is made about that the company you keep and the vibration of the food you take in affects your consciousness. So Persephone could have left except for the fact that she ate the food of the place. And by eating the food of that place, she now had that in her consciousness. And so she was allowed to return for part of the year, but not for all. So there's many, many, many themes that are buried in that story, but literally the having to take the innocence, go down to the underworld, to look at the shadows, to look at the things one's afraid of, and then to come back into, you're no longer the innocent one, but you could still enjoy the spring with her mother. The last story, which is one of the most powerful for me personally, and it comes in that category of transformational stories, is the story of Sita in the Indian Purans, or the Indian stories. And again, it's a very long one, so I'm just going to go into a main incident. So in the Indian Purans, the male-female is, the Purusha is the still, all-pervading, high self, consciousness from which everything occurs, that absolute stillness, self with a big S, God with a big G.
Yes, yeah.
And the feminine is Prakriti, or nature. And so the male-female pairings have a lot of that, and in this case, the Lord Vishnu, or the God of the preserver, who incarnates periodically, came during a time of trouble as the central figure, Ram, and Lakshmi, his consort, came into being as Sita. Now, there are parallels to the last story, and that parallel is Sita was the daughter of, she was born from the earth, like Demeter's daughter Persephone. Same thing, the earth goddess. So there's something about nature and about being born of the material, let's call it the material world. And Sita and Ram, because of an incident that happens, and along with someone else in the story, they go on an exile. So they were all kings and queens, and yet, someday I'm going to write a book called Out of the Palace into the Forest, because that's the theme of many Indian epics. They get thrown out of the palace. They actually leave voluntarily, and they're on a 14-year exile. But during that exile, just about the time when they're ready to come back and they've done everything, Sita is abducted. And the reason she's abducted is that she sees a golden deer. And she says to Ram, "Go get me that deer." And Ram's brother says, "You know there's no such thing as a golden deer. It's probably a demon in disguise." But she puts up a big fuss, and Ram has to go and get the deer for her. And while he does that, she's abducted by a demon, a very, very famous demon. And his name is Ravan. And she's held prisoner in the land of Sri Lanka, in Lanka, by Ravan for a long time. And then Ram has to fight a war to get her back. And there's a lot of that in there. But the story is this, and this is, I heard this from, I was able to attend a whole workshop on the Ramayana from Swami Jyotirmayananda, who's an enlightened sage. And he said, Sita represents the intuitive intellect that we have. So it's not intuition like get me a parking space. It's intuition like what is truth and what is not. And yet she's of the world, and she falls for the illusion, or she goes after the illusion of the golden deer, and it gets her in trouble. And what happens is she crosses the limits that have been put around her, and she's taken prisoner to Lanka. Now, what happens in Lanka is, while she's prisoner, is that they know that Sita will starve to death rather than eat the food of the place. Like Persephone did not eat the food of Hades. I mean, she did eat the food of Hades.
Yeah, right.
So Brahma, the Lord, sends an angel, without going into all the backstories, with a holy potion that she won't have to eat the food of that place. And that sustains her. So there's a tie-in again with that when you get distracted, or first of all, your journey to consciousness is ultimately about going through these dark places. And then, as with Sita, is to reunite. So the journey of the intuitive intellect is to marry again with God. So we want to come into incarnation. We want to play on the earth. We want to explore all these things. But we want to reunite with the high self, with the Purusha. And it requires a series of purifications. So there's a couple of themes for me, and I'm just going to wrap up with this thought, and then we can kind of talk about it or take questions or whatever. But all of these stories have in combination that there is no escaping the journey to the underworld. There is no escaping confronting, I will say, your worst fears or a journey into hell. And like with the Jews in the desert, you might be wandering around a long time, but be right next door to the promised land. But the time will come when the old slave mentality dies out, your slavery, your bondage to the things that have been important in the earth in your life, the false deer, all of those things, eating the food with your eyes or with your mind that is not good for you, that doesn't support your conscious evolution. And then spring comes, and to wrap up, as Ron said, ultimately, you don't have to effort, because at the moment, I'm going to come back to something Kerry teaches, in surrender, God will come and get you. Ram will come and rescue Sita, right? God will come and get you and reunite the two pieces of consciousness. So that's what I wanted to say, and I'll stop talking now and let you talk.
Well, I love these stories because, again, relating to my own, call it regular life, my spiritual journey, I think they're one and the same. Hitting these desert experiences, and one of the first questions that I would always ask is, well, how long is this going to be?
Right.
I can do it for a while, Yeah, I know. It's like now I look back at my life and went, I'm just now starting to live in my 60s, and I was like, I finally have this awareness. I don't know where, I was out serving, but it wasn't serving me. But until I had my desert experience with Ron's passing, and it's like I had no identification with it. You think, I serve, I love God, I pray, I do all these things. I shouldn't be treated like this because I earned my wings, and that was all ego. And I didn't know it was ego. So it really, for me, I had to die. And I remember a wise one says, Paul, you have to die. And I go, why? I earned this. Oh, and it's like, but earn what? My life, but you're supposed to give up your life. And so with Ron's passing, forced me to look inward at myself. And I came to the conclusion, only God could put a situation like this in my life. So I knew it came from God, but it still did not feel good at all. I mean, because let's face it, dying is hard. Dying is painful. And it was all again, about relationships. And so, again, what it did for me was it turned my gaze to God, and I trusted God even though it didn't feel good. And that was the beginning of this spiritual journey now that I'm on. And it's like, wow, but the scripture says we keep drinking the milk, but you need to eat the meat. It's like we need to go deeper. And I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to that. We had fun. We had these mystical experiences. And then this, I call it the shadow comes. Hades comes. You name what that is for you. And all of a sudden, you start to second guess, like, is there all that there is? But it's really the divine wooing us into a place of emptiness in order for the divine to show up and go, ta-da, here I am. Now come, and I'll feed from this nectar. And it's like, that's why I think the Eastern tradition is so rich, and it's the picture form that you just created for us. And it's like, I fall in love with that and want to do it more. I mean, I just know, too, Passover, Easter, Holy Week for me is such, I love it. And it goes back to, I don't want to say I suffer, but I really look at those pieces of me that don't serve me. And it's really I call it a rich tradition for me. Before, it's like, well, you have to do penance, you have to do this. And it's like, it's not about that anymore. It's about me letting go of me, the big I, or the small I, so the big one can take over. And it's like, that's why it's like, even in this last week during Holy Week, that's all I did was cry. I mean, it was another purification happening in my life. And I just know it's like another unfoldment. And it's like, okay, I know it's stirring again. So I know the Spirit is taking me to a different place. And I'm willing to go this time without the struggle.
And it's either, that's why, like with Jesus, you would think the 40 days in the desert was enough, but look what was the next thing waiting. And I just want to point out what you said is, and this is the part that people don't really like to look at. If you look at the physical end of a lot of these people, it weren't so great. Moses, he did get to lead the people, and they say he died at a very old age. I mean, there's wonderful things. He didn't get to the promised land, right?
I know. Yeah.
Jesus, we know how he left, what happened to his body and what he had to go through.
Right.
Persephone did get to go on. She does get to come back, but she has to alternate between the two. And when she goes down to Hades, she's queen of the underworld. So we're not saying that it is, but, you don't necessarily get happily ever after. And Sita, there's a lot that happens to her. So you may get the periods, like you just said, Paul, of that there is great, you went through all of this, and then you've had a time of you've never been as joyous or as free as I've seen you in the past couple of years. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you're not going through what you just said now, and it's a continuous process. And I've been in this process for years now. And for 5 years, I have been out of the palace into the forest, and I'm deep in the forest. So these stories help me. They help me remember.
Yeah.
So I was going to suggest that we open the lines and take questions, unless you want to add anything else.
Yeah, well, let's do that. See, this has touched your heart. So let's open up the lines.
Well, I guess we can hit the bar. It's a local bar, Paul. Hi, somebody's there. I hear a voice.
Oh, hi, Padre. Hi, Nettie. This is Mary Coyne.
Yes.
I just want to know that this was extremely profound for me to hear at this time in my life. And I can relate on many levels, and I just thank you so much for speaking of these things. They resonate very deeply.
You're welcome.
That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Perfect. I like that.
Hi,
It's nice to
can
hear
you
that.
guys hear me? I can.
Yes, we
yes.
can.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's so wonderful. This is Andrea. I'm a new student. I started on January 11th, so it was 11118. I'll never forget that. And what is so amazing about being part of this community is I've been on my path since I was 15. I'm 63. And everything that everybody talks about, it's like all these pieces of the puzzle are coming together. And I just feel so at home. I feel like, oh, thank God everybody else is going through this. Thank God everybody else is dying. Now I don't feel so alone.
Yes. I understand that spirit, Andrea, and it's like for coming into something new, like Celebrating Life, so it has many pieces, but when our hearts resonate, then we know, okay, let's walk this path for now. Might not be forever, but it's for now, and you recognize that. So to me, you're really recognizing the spirit leading you, which is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I'm just, Nettie, when you were talking, thank you so much, Padre Paul. And Nettie, when you were talking about all these different stories, everything resonated with me because I'm Jewish and I was a Hare Krishna, and I've touched on all these different pieces, and I thought, oh, well, now I'm being led to Celebrating Life, and where's all that other stuff going? And it's all coming together. So it's like, oh, that's where it's going. So,
love it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. I'm so glad.
Thank you for saying that, and it is true that there's really only one story, and that's how come they can keep telling it. It's the same thing with Luke going into the cave in the second Star Wars movie, which Empire Strikes Back, and he's with Yoda, and he has to go he got to go face that he is this Darth Vader. He doesn't even know he's the son of Darth Vader, but then he becomes this great light being. It's the same story. Yeah, it's the same story.
I guess the hard part is, in 2016, the whole year I was in the dark night of the soul, and then I got January 17th. So I got up for air, and I thought, okay, I'm great, I'm cool, No, back in August, it just went back down.
I don't mean to laugh. Yes.
No. I'm fine with that because thank God I'm up for a little bit of air right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we appreciate you sharing the story, Andrea, because it matches, I think, most of our lives, and to admit it and recognize it, I think, is a beautiful thing. So thank you for sharing, Andrea. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Someone else.
Nettie, this is Pam.
Hi, Pam.
In Arizona. Hi. I just want to thank you so much for sharing the 4 different stories, and it's so interesting to me just to see the common thread, how you were able to weave that through all 4 of the stories, and especially with the food principle. I found that really interesting, and I like how you applied that. So thank you so much. And the other point I wanted to say is just with Norm Shealy and Caroline Mace, it takes me back to some of the learnings and teachings that I had several years ago. So I like that. And then the reminders with the 5 stages of prayer and healing with Ron Roth, that's something I definitely want to pull back out, and it's a great reminder. So again, thank you. So many great nuggets of information that you just brought to light.
You're welcome. And you just said something also. I just want to tell you a little thing when I said about food, and also knowing that food is what you let yourself see and take in. And that's something which has always been an edge for me. But just talking about these stories, around 5 years ago, when I was teaching a group of Westerners about what led up to the Bhagavad Gita, so really the background of the Mahabharata, and I did this whole series of evening presentations, one of my Indian friends said to me, Nettie, you can see the old versions on YouTube. And I said, I need subtitles. But then later I typed in on YouTube, Mahabharata, English subtitles. And of course, there it was. And that launched many years now of an addiction to watching these incredible Indian dramas from every different generation, including right now, which get released either on YouTube or on DVD. And the reason I say the kind of food is that my friend Jan, I live in a shared house with a couple of people. We watch them almost every night. And sometimes we get tired of watching something, or she'll say, oh, let's watch a movie instead, or let's watch some, we'll watch something that makes us laugh. Right. But we have observed over years that when we don't watch one of the Purans before we go to bed, we have a different kind of sleep. We wake up different kinds of people, and it's a form of food. It's a form of food for the mind.
Mm-hmm. That is beautiful.
Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Just like manna, once a day.
Just like once a day.
Thank you. I definitely need that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pam. Appreciate the insights.
Sure. Thank
Someone
you.
else. Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Hi, this is Catherine.
Hi.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi. I was waiting to see if someone else wanted to talk because I always speak up. But I really appreciate all these. I love all these stories. I think it's so pertinent now because we're living in some rather turbulent times, I would say, and that the ability to take in from every single culture, the stories of how you need to be patient and know that you're going to be taken care of, the manna, or however the food you have, or where you're going. It may not look like you're going somewhere, but you actually are going somewhere. You're in a process, and we're all in a process, and we think it needs to be very linear and like I want to know where we're going today, or where are we going next week, or what's going to happen in 5 years, and that's not the story right now, and I don't think it ever has been, and that's why all these myths and tales and stories are so important for us, because it's such a journey that is not, sometimes it's straight, but sometimes it's very tangled and like wandering 40 years in this very small area. It's not a big space.
Oh, that's good.
We're crossing paths all the time, and we passed this trail before, and, So I feel like I'm learning how to not react so much, but to just live so much in the moment and feed myself what helps me. Like you said, either what I'm reading or what I'm looking at or what I'm saying or who I'm with. And certainly Celebrating Life is, for me, is huge spiritual food that I get in the spring and I get in the fall that fill me up till the next night.
I concur that too, Catherine. But again, it's going through the hard pieces. I call it the suffering that we all go through. People don't like to talk about it, but they're actually going through it. But when they come through it, then this rebirth happens, and it's all about this consciousness. And it's like, if we, not like the Israelites, complain about where's my manna, it's like we have that old tendency to still complain, even though we know God is faithful. And it's in that place that we can encourage one another. That's why I think spiritual gatherings are so important. Go outside your home so you can listen to a different beat instead of the same old, same old. So we're blessed, and I just appreciate everybody being on the call tonight. I think we've really tapped into another place of consciousness, and Nettie led us the way there. So I appreciate that, Nettie. As you can see, she's very engaging, and that is really a gift she has. And that spirit of joy, if you get around her, she loves to laugh like I do, because it is about just the freedom of just being. And that's why I love these conversations that we have, especially in our monthly
and not taking yourself seriously, right?
Oh, my God. We could laugh all night, just the crazy things we've done. So, but there's the joy. It's still there, because you can't duplicate joy. We can try, but it really it does come from our essence. Well, what I like to do is I like to end with prayer, which we normally do, and for whatever, I call it, whatever your need is. And I loved how when Nettie talked about the divine is always present. It's always present, and sometimes we neglect tapping into that source. And Nettie, if I could ask you to just do one chant, just to tap in, and then I'll maybe have some words of knowledge or prayers specifically for some places that we need healing for.
Okay. So I'm going to do a chant that asks for peace for not only the whole world, but at every level, like we say, at the mind, spirit, and body. And the words have been a little bit different than some people are familiar with, but here we go.
That's okay.
Samastaloka Sukhino Bhavantu. Samastaloka Sukhino Bhavantu. Samastaloka Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
That's such a sweet sound. Let's just take that sound in the silence, because you felt that vibration in your heart. And with the connection to the heart, we have access to the whole body. So let that deep peace that passes all understanding now to go down to every organ in our body, cleansing it, renewing it, restoring it. Let them hear the echo of heaven, of the divine. Whisper in their ears, you are whole, you are complete, you are healed by the very Ruach of God. Come forth, Holy Spirit. Renew us, restore us, bring us out of the dark night, and allow grace to flow like living water for our substance, for our support. Continue to bless. Whatever heaven has, it says there's riches in heaven. The streets are paved in gold and silver and diamonds and jewels. So there shall be on earth. So we allow that goodness of God, the resources of heaven, now to manifest in each and everyone's life. With the sages, with the saints, the cloud of witnesses, they're all here for us. Let those spiritual deposits of heaven become the food, the manna we eat right now, for tomorrow, for the next day. And allow that bloom of heaven, that blossoming, that seed that was laid dormant and now becomes alive and grows. So we bless our health, our relationships, our finances, but ultimately our relationship with the divine. Thank you, O Lord our God, for that living breath. Thank you, God, for the love of God for us as beloved daughters and sons. Amen. So be it.
Amen.
It is so. Amen. Well, thank you, Nettie. Love to do this again. Thanks for being on the call.
Thanks for having me. And thanks, everybody, and good night, and God bless.
Namaste.